What is the purpose of a criminal justice system? To reduce crime rates? To protect members of the community? To punish those who have done wrong, perhaps? The easy answer may be to bring about justice. But if so, what actually is justice? If you type that question into Google, you will quickly find that the answer differs every way you look, depending on the person speaking, the perspective from which they speak, and the model of justice they're speaking about. Because the model of justice that our Western system works under may be what we have existed within for centuries, but it is only one of many models available to us. It is a punitive model of justice, and it functions on the ideas that, 1, punishment can alter a person's behaviour and successfully deter future crime. 2, that offenders will only take responsibility through the means of punishment. And 3, the most appropriate way to decide on that punishment is through an eye for an eye mentality that says every action should be met by similar action. The presumptions that underpin this system are that violence, crime, and harm are the result of dangerous and bad people, and that by giving out just the right amount of punishment, we will succeed in deterring these people from committing crimes, keeping the community safe by doing so. But what is the reality of our criminal justice system? Does it actually do what it sets out to do? After 8 years within the legal industry myself, including time as a lawyer in both criminal prosecution and defence, I've experienced firsthand the ways in which our system does not achieve what it sets out to achieve. And in many ways, I believe it makes things worse. The Australian Government Productivity Commission into Australia's prison dilemma found that 46% of offenders sentenced in Victoria to prison will end up back in prison within 2 years of being released. Can we really say that this is a system that successfully deters future crime? I say no, and here's why. Violence, crime, and harm are not the result of dangerous and bad humans. They are the result of the social context and personal history of complex humans just like you and I. Over and over again in my time as a lawyer, I was handed examples of people who society has labelled as bad. A 20-year-old man who committed a series of armed robberies, stealing cars and guns from people's homes. A woman who stole people's cars at knife point, leaving multiple people traumatised. But after watching these people sit in the dock at the back of a courtroom and listening to their stories, I came to realise that they were just ordinary people like you and I, who had been handed the perfect storm of life circumstances. That 20-year-old man had been brought up by a father with a criminal record 10 pages long, and a mother who every time we sat in court would yell out to her son that she was proud of what he'd done. The woman who committed those carjackings had become homeless at the age of 12 after a childhood of physical and sexual abuse. She had an IQ of only 43 and had committed her crimes after being given methamphetamines by people in her group home, who had then instructed her to commit those crimes for them. You see, what a punitive model of justice fails to take into consideration are the actual drivers behind crime. Factors such as economic stress and poverty, adverse childhood experiences, isolation, the effects of patriarchy, colonialism, and white supremacy, domestic violence, abuse, intergenerational crime, education level, substance abuse, and more. In fact, within a punitive model of justice, many of these factors are exacerbated rather than helped. A recent study by the University of Melbourne comparing the health and social outcomes of prisoners with and without a mental illness found that over 50% of prisoners expect to be homeless upon their release, and over 60% were still unemployed 6 months later. And that's without mentioning the already innately traumatizing and isolating experience that being in prison is in and of itself. But it's not just the offenders that a punitive model of justice fails. It's the victims of those crimes too. In 2015, I experienced what no woman wants to experience, but far too many women do. I was raped by a man who, at the time, I called my best friend. I held off reporting my rape for 3 years after it happened and thought I was never going to. I was very aware that only 1 in every 10 sexual offences reported to police ever result in a conviction. And I didn't know if I would be able to deal with a courtroom questioning my experience when so many people in my life had already done so. But in 2018, whilst working as a criminal prosecutor, I decided that I wanted the chance to tell my story, thinking that my legal education and experience might make the process easier on me. But unfortunately, that was far from the truth. The charges against the man who raped me never made it to trial, as so many cases like mine don't. The decision to withdraw charges was made before I ever gave evidence in court, something I feel both grateful for and let down by. Grateful that I didn't have to relive my trauma in front of a room full of strangers or go through the grueling and non-consensual process that is cross-examination. Grateful that I didn't have to worry anymore about not being the perfect victim. And grateful that a process that had already gone on for 18 months since reporting might finally come to an end. But more than any of that, I felt let down. Let down that I didn't get the chance to tell my story in court. And let down that a system that is meant to care for the safety of the community still relies so heavily on laws and policies that re-traumatize those who've been harmed the most. Because this is what a punitive model of justice requires. The presumption that those who commit harm are bad requires a process of dehumanizing the offender, so much so that that dehumanization inevitably flows to the victim as well. The victim is a witness in a Crown case against an evil offender, rather than a real and traumatized human who has been harmed by another real and potentially traumatized human. No matter what laws and policies are put in place around victim support, nothing can adequately make up for the adversarial and non-consensual nature that is a punitive criminal process. The moment I walked into that police station, I stopped being a human and I became a witness whose reliability had to be tested, whose story had to be questioned, and whose emotional stability had to be ascertained. And any flaw that was inevitably uncovered was marked against my name like red ink that read reasonable doubt. And of course it did. Because when the stakes are so high, when the result of believing one person means sending another to the fringes of society, we must be certain. I want to offer you an alternative today to how we can deal with harm, to show you that there is another better way for us to do things. And that way is transformative justice. Transformative justice models view crime and harm in an entirely different way than a punitive model. Where punitive justice focuses solely on crime, transformative justice focuses on harm. Where punitive justice looks at crime as a violation against the state, transformative justice views harm as a violation between people and relationships. Transformative justice models view harm not as the result of bad people, but of unhealthy social circumstances and systems, and it seeks to heal harm in order to prevent further harm. A transformative model asks questions such as, who has been harmed here and what are their needs? Who is accountable for this harm? Are they willing to take responsibility? And what do they need in order to do so? Who else has a stake in this situation? And what would it look like to involve them in this process? What are the social systems and circumstances that promoted or led to this harm in the first place? And what measures can or should be put in place in order to prevent further harm on an individual and a collective level? Most importantly, transformative justice allows room for harm to be defined outside of the crime committed. It allows room for acknowledging that not only the victim can experience harm, but also the victim's friends and family and the local community, as well as the offender and their loved ones. A few weeks after the charges were withdrawn against the man who raped me, I listened to a podcast interview by my now dear friend Marley Liss, whose sexual assault case was the first in North America to go through a process like this inside the court system. As I stood in my kitchen and listened to Marley explain how the man who had assaulted her had gone through a year of therapy before they met together in an 8-hour circle, and the profound healing that had occurred not only for her, but also for him, I wept. I stood in my kitchen and I wept for longer than I had allowed myself to weep in the 6 years since being raped. Huge, convulsing, snotty tears that cried, why didn't I get this? Why wasn't this available to me? And why wasn't this available to him? Because possibly the biggest driver behind my decision not to report for all those years was that I didn't want to be the reason that this man went to prison. In fact, I didn't want him to go to prison at all. I didn't want to go through a process that I knew would ultimately only ever lead to more harm. I wanted him to heal just as much as I wanted that for myself. But that option wasn't available to me. I knew that it existed. I'd even written a thesis on it, but I knew that it wasn't an option in Australia for violent or adult offenders. And so in the absence of having the system that I wanted and needed, I'd chosen the system that I had. And ultimately, that system had failed both of us. The ramifications of how we deal with harm are much more far-reaching than just those matters that the police and courts deal with. Harm is an inevitable part of life. Whether it's a disagreement between friends, an indiscretion by a lover, online bullying, domestic violence, corporate greed, harm inflicted upon marginalised communities, or global conflict in the way we treat our planet. Not only are we constantly trying to wade through complex situations, feelings, and belief systems, but we also live in a world that exacerbates harm every day through systemic oppression such as patriarchy, colonialism, and capitalism. Our criminal justice system is simply a microcosm of our society as a whole. And much the same way that we learn to model behaviour of our parents when we are children, we learn to model the way that we deal with harm off the system that we see deal with it the most. So what if this conversation today isn't just about the way that our criminal justice system deals with crime, but about the way that every one of us deals with the any number of ways that we see harm in our day-to-day life? Do we desire to keep choosing a system that relies on labelling the person who commits harm as bad, relegating them to the fringes of society? A model that doesn't seek to heal or understand, but rather furthers divisiveness? Or do we decide to learn a model that actively advocates for leaning in, coming together and finding a way through the mud whilst remaining firmly rooted in our own humanity? A system that not only cares about healing all parties harmed, but actively seeks to change the conditions that led to that harm in the first place. Because what happens when we realise that we are in fact the one who has caused harm to another? What happens when we realise that we have caused harm to ourselves? Do we suddenly become bad? Or do we simply push that part of ourselves down so far that we can once again pretend that we are 100% good and therefore that our place in the community is safe? This is what a punitive model of justice demands of us. It doesn't allow a safe space for accountability, because to admit that you have caused harm is to admit that you too should be punished and shunned. Transformative justice offers us a better way. It actively encourages accountability and makes it safe to do so, because the presumptions are that you have good in you, that you are capable of doing better and deserving of the love and support that will get you there. So, the question that I would love to leave you with today is this: where in your life right now is there room for you to remember that all of us are more than good or bad? And how can you invite yourself to begin to honour that today? Because change can be brought from the top down, but it can also unfurl from the bottom up, taking into account every single part of our being and allowing us all to exist beyond the binary as it does.